everyone. First, I would like to send my greetings to you wherever you are. Welcome to this event organized by the HUPO Education and the Training Committee, or HUPO ETC. And we are proud to continue this ETC Stylish Academic Writing webinar series today, which is already the third one. So this webinar series aims to help students and trainees to improve their scientific writing skills. Please stay tuned for our future webinars. My name is Yangshan Liu. I'm assistant professor at Yale University. The other two panelists joining me today are from the ETC committee as well, Blending Tajarin from Cedar Sinai Heart Institute, a senior postdoc in the Van Eyck Lab, and then Deputy Joshua Kondu, the scientific curator from PRIDE team and the EBI. So there is really no need to introduce today's speaker to the audience because Ruedi is such a well-known leader in our field and mentored many young scientists. Just as the example, the Aebersold Lab has trained 50 faculties internationally, including myself. So just to keep it short though, Professor Ruedi Aebersold is now an emeritus professor at ETH Zurich, Switzerland. He was trained firstly at the University of Basel and completed his education at Caltech. He was then a faculty in the University of British Columbia and then the University of Washington, and co-founded the Institute for Systems Biology in Seattle. In 2004, he was recruited to ETH Zurich, where he established the Institute of Molecular Systems Biology. Ruedi's lab has pioneered several widely used techniques and tools that have contributed to today's proteomics research. His publications have been cited almost 200,000 times with the H factor of 214, according to Google Scholar. He has co-founded several companies as well, and Ruedi received numerous awards such as the Marcel Benoist Prize and many others. So, okay, I will stop here. And before Ruedi's presentation, we would like Blending to give a quick introduction about this Pool Everywhere website that we want to try this time so that we could have a more interactive Q&A today. So you can also use the Q&A in the Zoom link if you want to ask your questions. So let Blending start, and I will try to go to this link.
Can you share your screen with the link and the QR code for Pool Everywhere, please?
Yeah.
Thank you. Welcome, everyone. So today we are trying to introduce the scientific community to a platform named Pool Everywhere. The goal is to know you better and to have a more interactive session with you. So we will share soon a slide in which you can see the link you can use to join the Pool Everywhere platform from your phone or from your computer. And you have also a QR code that you can scan to jump directly into the Pool Everywhere platform. Okay, so we have people mostly from Europe. We have people from Asia. I can see people from Australia. I can see people from Canada, from US.
Nice.
Welcome, everybody. Okay, then because this panel is dedicated to help early career scientists, we have a little bit of interest for the position you're currently at. And so we would like to know which one of those are you close to. I know we have Crazy Postdoc, just quoting Ruedi's comment here. We have also PI and Emeritus Professor. Ruedi, don't hesitate to add your position to this map too. Okay, we have a lot of PhD student, bachelor, master, postdoc, PI. Nice. That's very nice. We have plenty of different positions. I'm surprised we have that number of bachelor and master. Thank you for joining us. It's also for you. And we have a lot, of course, of PhD. Makes sense, I would say. I think we will stop here for the moment. Thank you all for taking this journey with me. And today, as it was mentioned, we have the pleasure to welcome Ruedi to make a talk about how to develop your career with writing. So Ruedi, stage is yours now.
Okay, thank you. Let me first try to share the screen.
That's perfect. We can see your screen.
Okay, great.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for everyone for joining in. I think this is HUPO should be commended, and the group that organizes these events, because it addresses an important issue in everyone's career, and that is how to write papers. Now I need to quickly get out of this because I need to close the window. Okay. So I tried to already in the title emphasize how important writing is for advancing a career, a scientific career. So I assume that we have here students of all kinds of levels, maybe also young PIs, and everyone who is listening in, I would assume is, or I was assuming when I was preparing for the talk, that these individuals have an interest in a career in science. So there is significance of writing papers is, of course, apparent to everyone probably, but I wanted just to make it again very clear. Research papers are critically important for a career in science. Critically important means no papers, probably no academic career. So that's what I mean with critical. For positions in other fields of science, which are of course equally valuable careers, for instance, biotech, pharma, consulting, and so on, papers are also important, but they may not be as critical. So you might be able to, of course, start a biotech company without having papers published, but I think it is certainly helpful. So, but for whatever career you choose, a paper matters only if others notice and read it. So this is going to be a reoccurring theme here, that I try to describe how you can write a paper that's actually meaningful, because everyone can write a paper and publish a paper because there's so many journals. I make a few comments about that. But I think if you want to make a career in science, you should write papers that matter in the sense that others notice them and they describe a progress in the field. So scientific writing is hard. It's a lot of work. So I think it's good to think about why actually we would write papers in addition to just thinking about a career. So a published paper is a conclusion of an important piece of work. It should be a unique piece of work. No one else has done that. It's pioneering, it's new ground, and I think you should be really proud of that if you succeed. It's a lasting record. People might read the paper for a long time, even when you have maybe moved on. And it basically is a stamp that you place in the history of science that you have achieved something. It's a reward, although it is hard to achieve a paper, but it's clearly reward. It's really an uplifting experience if you see the paper eventually appear. It's a showpiece for your family and friends when they probably don't know exactly what you're doing or may not want to know or understand what you're doing. But if you can show, I published a paper, I think everyone will be impressed. It's certainly an accomplishment. It's also a responsibility for those who fund your work, and that's usually the taxpayer. I think it's a minimalistic assumption that every paper published costs at least $100,000 to generate. This number is probably way too small. I mean, I certainly know of papers which have probably cost in the range of $1 million to generate. So someone pays for that money, and this is usually a taxpayer. So, but as I think the main point that I think I will hope you will take along, throughout this talk is it is a key, published paper that is meaningful is a key to your research career. So now when I was putting this together, I thought how I could structure that, and I thought I would structure this talk as one would structure a project. So the project has a title, has a background section, a name, project plan, and then how we deal with problems and solutions. So this is the structure I'm going to follow. The title is very easily apparent now. The title project is you want to publish your work in a way that supports your career goals. So it has to be novel, it has to be meaningful, it has to be well communicated that you pass the high threshold levels of peer review and that people then read it. So this is the goal. And now we go to provide some background about scientific publishing. So some facts, trends, and projections about scientific publishing. And that, I think, is an important background information, because it should affect you, how you choose a project, how you position yourself in the research environment, as I will try to show, to produce the most meaningful work that you can produce with the effort that you have available. So here are some facts and figures about scientific publishing. Some may be very surprising to you. It is in fact so that scientific publishing is a huge enterprise, also a huge economic enterprise. There are now an estimated 2,000 academic publishers. It is estimated that there are currently about 30,000 academic journals, and the number is going up. These are numbers from this source down here. There is more than 2 million journal articles published every year, which is also expected to increase. And the global scholarly publishing market, so this is not like Fox News or New York Times, this is scholarly publishing, scientific publishing, is a huge industry of, in 2018, about 27 billion, and it's growing. So now, if you just look at these numbers, it will be apparent that if you publish a paper, it's one of about 2 million. So it is, of course, a good question how you make your paper so that it stands out and people actually appreciate and read it, because no one can read 2 million papers, of course, not even all the papers in a field, even in a narrow field. So now everyone, of course, wants to publish in papers that matter. And so these papers, of course, as everyone knows, have hugely various impact factors. I'm coming to the impact factor back. But so there's currently about, in scope, in Clarivariate, so this is Web of Science, is about 21,500 journals listed. Of those are about 1,000 biology journals. And of those 1,000 biology journals, 1,005, 85 have an impact factor of 10 or more. So you already see that there is a huge discrepancy in the impact factor of journals. And everyone, of course, wants to publish in journals that have impact factor of 10 or higher. But this is a very, very high threshold. And if you look over here, what these highest impact factor journals are, these are mostly either reviews or these are journals from the well-known Cell, Nature, and Science class of journals. So what I'm trying to say is that with this, if you generate work that is worth publishing, even if it's not published in these 85 journals, biology journals with impact factor 10 or more, you're still in an elite class. So because about 2,400 journals have an impact factor of 1, and these are the ones one should certainly go for. But there is also, it's a remarkable fact that comes out of Web of Science, that there is 19,000 of the 21,500 journals listed that have an impact factor of less than 1. So that means the papers are in average cited less than 1. And these, of course, are the journals one should try to avoid. because no one basically reads them if the goal is to do a career in science. It's fine to publish in these journals if one wants to bolster the CV, but if one wants to have an impact, obviously the impact from these journals may not be so high. So now who reads these all these millions of papers published? There's a lot of scientific papers out there. One estimate, this is from a study that was published in 2007, it's down here, says that not many people read articles. Half of academic papers are read only by the authors, the journal editors, and the studies author and the studies authors write. So no one outside the people have to write them and read them. This is, of course, these type of articles will not have a great impact. It should be pretty obvious. Now a comment about impact factor journals, which to some extent puts what I just said in perspective. There is journals that publish very different numbers of articles. And here is a graph that shows the number of articles published by +1 is in thousands of articles on this axis. And Nature, which of course is one of the journals with the highest impact factor, and they publish very few articles. If you look at the distribution of citations of these two journals, we see that Nature, of course, has on average at the peak a higher number of citations, but it's not actually very high compared to +1. And the reason Nature and some other journals, very elite journals, have such high impact factors is because they tend to have and strive to have a number of papers which have very high citations. And these papers, of course, because the overall output of this journal is relatively low, I mean, in terms of numbers of articles, then a journal with an impact factor of 100, with 100 citations, has very high effect on the impact factor of the journal. So this has, of course, been recognized by the field, and there is a declaration, the DORA, San Francisco Declaration on Research Assessment, DORA, that says, do not use journal-based metrics, for instance, the impact factor of a journal, as a surrogate measure of the quality of individual research articles or scientists to assess an individual scientist's contribution on hiring, promotion, or funding decisions. So this is, I would encourage everyone who is in review panels, in recruitment panels, to always think about this DORA declaration and basically reject a statement when someone in a committee says, or even by recruitment of a student or whatever the environment would be, or in a grant review and says, that person has a paper in Nature, it must therefore be a good scientist. So my point would be, we should strive to publish papers which have a high likelihood that they're being cited, but they will not only be good and high visible papers if they are in the top ranked journals, like impact factor 10 or plus, 10 or more, but in papers which are respectable journals, which have a high quality of peer review, then a paper which is a good paper will eventually swim up to the top and accrue a number of citations. And now this is just a side note, kind of a warning, that there is a lot of journals which are predatory journals. These are not actually included in these in these 30,000 or so journals, but they have been springing up over the last few years. And these journals have no intent to actually contribute to the advance of science. Their only intent is to make money from bilking people who would then write journals under the articles and submit them and pay for the submissions under the disguise that they would be quickly reviewed and published. So, I mean, predatory journals are actually relatively hard to find, but I would encourage everyone to read this article here, which was in Nature 2019, which deals with predatory journals. And every scientist should be try who wants to publish something should make an effort to avoid submitting something to predatory journals, using some of the criteria that are described in this Nature article. Okay, so now we said that we should, of course, strive to publish papers which are meaningful, and we said that the impact factor of the journal in which this article appears is not a good metric, and this is adhering to the DORA declaration. So what is a good metric? A good metric is how many people read and cite your paper over time. Now you might say, well, I don't have the time. I'm a postdoc and I'm looking for an initial assistant professor appointment, and it takes time to accrue a citation. This is certainly true, but it is also so that if a paper is read, and come back to later on how you can make sure or at least facilitate that the paper is read, that citations will relatively quickly start to accrue if the work is considered worthwhile. Now, I just want to make a few comments about citations again, because there is also a lot of misconceptions. This was again from Nature, an article they once wrote. It's now a while back, but it is I found it quite striking. So let's assume that someone would make a copy of the front page of every paper published up to 2014. And then you would make a pile of these front page photocopies, and then basically ranked by the citations they accrued. So the surprising first fact is that if you stacked all these front pages, you would reach the height of almost Kilimanjaro, 5,900 meters. Probably now, since almost a decade has passed, probably Kilimanjaro has been surpassed in height. Now, when you look where these where papers with more than citations would be in this, it would be top 1.5 meters. So this is very, very hard to achieve, and rarely happens. I think what this also shows is that papers which have maybe not be readable very well, but if papers which have between 1 and 10 or 100 and 1,000 citations, certainly the between 100 and plus citations are very elite articles. And even if you accrue 10 citations, you're more than halfway up to Kilimanjaro. So I think this puts the impact metrics somewhat in perspective, and I think this is a much better metric of the value the journal article has, is to see how many times it has been cited over, let's say, 2 years. And if someone achieves a paper, just to put this in perspective, of 10 or 20 citations, this is a very successful story, because most papers are never cited. Okay, now it was now some background about the landscape. Now let's see, let's take a few facts and figures to discuss how you could make your work possibly more impactful when you're planning projects or a research environment. I would encourage you to read periodically this blog from Mike Lauer at NIH. I think this is excellent, extremely informative. It's called Open Mic, and he publishes or discusses periodically interesting facts and figures and background information about NIH and scientific life in general. So he can do that because the NIH has accrued over years, over decades actually, exactly the number of papers published, the number of grants awarded, the number of papers published per grant. I mean, they have a treasure of information, and Mike analyzes some of these results and then puts them in perspective. So one of the trends that has happened is that the number of authors on NIH-supported papers has been going up. So this may not be particularly surprising, because many, especially in life sciences, many projects have become more complicated. Maybe there's collaborations of 2 or 3 groups. So, but this is a distinctive trend which is supported by thousands and thousands of papers. The implications for individual authors, of course, is that if you are, especially a young scientist, if you're an author that is one of 10 authors on a co-authors, then it matters that you can make known, well, where you are on the paper and whether you can make known what your contribution is. But so right now, I'm just saying the number of authors has gone up. But then it becomes more interesting because he then correlates, Mike Lauer correlates the number of authors to the relative citation ratio for papers published. This is data that go back a while, but I think it's still the same. So what we see here, that if you're striving to do impactful work, it appears that the more authors are on a paper, that means probably people who are contributing to a paper, to a story published in a paper from different angles. So the more authors they are, the more impactful the journal article generally gets as a trend, of course, as a broad distribution. And this is interesting, of course, for students and for young investigators when they, for instance, would think about whether they should collaborate with someone in a related field. The data here shows that this might actually make sense to collaborate, to pool resources and knowledge to publish a paper that has more authors, but is also more impactful. I mean, this is, of course, for very rare that there's hundreds of authors, but in the life sciences, in this domain here, between 5 and 10 authors is actually a number that is very frequently occurring. And then we can also ask, this is now data from a large program in Switzerland, where we were forced at the end, or enticed, so this was called Systems X. It was a systems biology program, and one of the mandates was that every paper that was published out with that funding mechanism would have scientists from more than one scientific field. And then at the end, we were forced or asked to do a bibliometric analysis, which was done by the University of Leiden, who have a special department which measures the impact of papers on the scientific literature. And I just wanted, what they did here is they took papers, this was 580 papers published by this consortium over its duration. And they then created control groups or reference groups from scientists in Germany, the UK, and Switzerland, which have similar research fields, similar publication strategies and culture. And then they measured what were the impact of the papers published by these different groups. So I can go here to this number, which this is what fraction of papers from these respective groups were published in the top 10% of citations. So if this number was 10%, they would publish exactly as the average one would expect. But so each one of these groups surpassed the average, basically was doing more impactful than normal or the average. And we can see here Germany was higher than average, the UK was higher than average, Switzerland was higher than average. But this Systems X group of papers was 3 times higher than the average expected impact of the papers. And we think that this was due to the fact that people were forced to collaborate from different fields, for instance, from physicists or computer scientists, biologists, and so on. So what I try to say here is just that the impact can be to some extent engineered if one considers from at the beginning of a project how the project could be structured, and projects that are at interfaces draw from knowledge from different fields and probably use different tools and approaches have a tendency to achieve a higher impact. So this is basically was the introduction. And what I try to show is that scientific publishing is an enormous enterprise. The career value of research papers varies greatly from 0 impact to great impact. The career value of papers depends on the contents, but it can also be influenced by the type of research and the structure of a project. So I think if a project tries to incorporate some interesting or innovative parts that might be borrowed or generated through collaboration. This is a benefit. Career building papers can also be published in lower impact factor journals, but it takes longer for their value to appear. So that citations versus impact factor discussion, citations are clearly better, not perfect, but it's clearly better than the impact factor of journals. And high impact life science projects have become more complex and interdisciplinary. There's a clear trend supported by this analysis from Mike Lauer. And so I think team science generates tendentially higher impact research results, but it is more difficult to identify the contribution of each author. Okay, so this was some background which I try to address in some of the comments about the next parts of this presentation. So again, let's go to the general aim. The general aim to build a publication record that supports the intended scientific career. This is what we try to achieve in this project or this talk, structured along the lines of a project. What I just tried to say before is that we have we can generate or write down or declare some specific aims. Define the intended career, of course, everyone has to do that, and then select a research project and host group or environment that are aligned with this intended career goal. So these two I'm not going to discuss, but I already tried to show with some of these graphs about what type of research may be particularly impactful, how one can possibly structure a project that the papers coming out are particularly impactful, are actually preceding the start of the project and are dependent to some extent on the career decisions where someone wants to work, in which environment, in which research group, and so on. But so I will not describe this further. These are preliminary steps, and I assume everyone has already chosen where they work, and they have chosen their field of research, have chosen their environment. Now we're gonna discuss how we can write papers with the highest potential to support the career advancement. So the project plan would be write papers with the highest potential to support a career advancement. So now I make some comments about these points here and go through one by one. General considerations is that academic writing should be is highly different from non-academic writing. So academic writing is formal, is impersonal, is objective. It should be very sharp. It should be it should be unambiguous. And the audience, of course, are fellow academics, and you don't need to entertain them with a paper, you need to inform them. Whereas if one is addressing in non-academic writing a general public, maybe the entertainment factor and capturing the attention is more important. But here it is really the purpose is to communicate knowledge. The aim is to present warranted information arguments. One should use very sharp language, formal language, and well-defined words. One should think about what does the word mean, and not, which is, of course, it's not casual writing. And it is good to use short sentences and standard structure, and we'll come back to the structure of the paper, just in a few minutes. And of course, a big difference between scientific and non-scientific writing is that every statement that is written in a research paper has to be supported either by the data that are shown or by references. And one cannot just make up some statement that one puts in to make the text flow better. So these are general comments about the distinction between academic writing and non-academic writing. So these are now a few points that I think want to emphasize, following up from this previous graph. The easier and more clear you make the text for the reviewer and reader, the better the paper will be treated. So you have to think about that initially when you submit the text, reviewers will have to read it. If the reviewers have to scratch their head for hours to figure out what you meant with the wording, even if the contents is absolutely super, then they will be negatively inclined. So to make it easier for the reader, for the reviewer, but also, of course, the reader later on, it is worthwhile to try to work really hard to make the statements clear and not as clear as possible. Every word has meaning and every word counts. One should not make it too wordy, the text. One should really put the words down that mean something and really stick to these words that are counting, and try to avoid ambiguous words. Use clear technical writing. The less ambiguity is, the better, even if it may appear repetitive at times. So we're not trying to write prose which has to look beautiful and where beautiful sentences are constructed. The main meaning, the main task is to write clearly and convey information. So a scientific paper is not a piece of art, and consider a paper a scientific story you're telling to an audience. And I think it's good rule to have one paper, one message, so that then one knows, the reader knows what the message was conveyed, and then it is understood and not a convoluted story. So then I think a very critical point in my experience is prepare before you start writing. I experienced many times that students and postdocs say, now I want to write a paper, they start writing, but they actually don't have the story in their mind. So I think good steps would be to define, maybe together with your supervisor or colleague from the department, when the work is complete and when the writing should begin. If the work is not complete, if one starts writing, then it is not going to, it's basically a waste of time, because one always has to come back to the same text. Get the science story you want to tell clear in your head before you're starting to type. Do not develop the story in front of the computer. I think it is stressful if one sits down and says, I want to write something, and then the story is not really conceived yet. And then one starts to write, and then one says it's the wrong track, has to erase, and so on. So this is, I think it's very good advice to say, I need to first get the story. I need to be able to explain it to someone. So tell the story to someone. Talking is much easier than writing, and also to revise the story. This could be through a presentation to a lab, friends, family, if necessary, the cat. But I think you should, before you sit down and write text, you should be able to explain in words what you want, what this paper is about, to someone else, even if it's just yourself. If explain it to yourself. When the story feels right, it is a time to start writing. Because if one recounts a story to someone, and then all of a sudden one gets stuck and there is a conceptual or logical gap, then one knows one has to work on the consistency of the message before one starts to put a lot of words down on a computer. So then some further, we move on to actually then assume now we have the story ready. And now this represents a structure of a paper which certainly in our world has worked very well. So I think it's useful to track through main topics, and only the main topics, through all the sections of a paper. I mean, every paper has roughly the same structure. It has an abstract, it has an introduction, has a result section, discussion section, and then some conclusions. So I think that the main topics, the main points what the author wants to make should be tracked through consistently through all these sections, from abstract to intro to results and discussion. And the introduction should, so this helps up here, this helps to reinforce the message. The reader should already know from the abstract what is roughly coming. In the introduction, the same points would be expanded, and then the results discussion, the results should then reinforce or basically support the topics that were introduced with the results that one wants to show. The introduction is frequently written in a very convoluted way because the person wants to show that they really know broadly what the field of science. This is not the purpose of the introduction. The introduction is not a general literature review, but focused on this message that one should be able to say, that everyone should be able to say and explain at the beginning before the writing. Discuss only prior work that is relevant for the message and not dozens of papers which are peripherally related to the message. The result section, I think, is the hardest to write. And I think good advice would be, I think this has worked well, is to use chapters, basically structure the overall story into little pieces, and each of these pieces has its own internal structure. So these chapters or headings would indicate that now a part of the story is being told, would be headed by a section heading, and then for each one of these headings, I think the following substructure generally works very well. It is worthwhile to start out this section or paragraph with stating what is this section about. This can be only one sentence and say, now we're talking about this. So the reader is oriented where in the whole story the reader should find himself or herself. And then I think it's useful to describe briefly what was done. Of course, one could argue this is all described in detail in the method section, which is true, but it's still very useful to say what this section is about, and then what was done specifically without going into technical details, and then just summarize the results. Just describe the results without any discussion, without any evaluation, just summarize very briefly what came out, what the data structure looks like, and that's usually when one refers to figures. And then the reader wants to know, okay, now we have seen this figure, what does the author think this data actually means? And then this would mean an interpretation, not necessarily discussion of these results, but a interpretation what the data that's shown actually means in the context of the story. And then I think what usually helps also is at the end of each one of these sections to add a sentence and say, this section was about this, and this what we conclude it means. So then I think with this, if you adhere to such a structure in the results section, even complicated, and if you have in mind what the message would be, how the story flows, then I think it's actually relatively straightforward to write a nice, flowing, and complete results section that is easy to understand. And then the comment to the discussion, it should be not a general discussion of the field. It's not a review. It should focus on putting the new results in the context and point out the limitations. So this is, I think, a structure that has worked quite well. So how can you develop writing skills? It's hard to do. It requires practice. And I think the best thing is to write and then to show the text, discuss the text with someone who is more experienced, so for adaptation and to gain experience. I think also what is very effective is to practice structured talks of your work. It could be some elevator speech, or it could be, for instance, a presentation in a lab meeting that the person who wants to write a paper would be asked to say, okay, now you basically are in a position to present how you want to structure your story. And we used to do that at times in our lab, and it was amazingly effective because with the feedback from lab members, the stories could be shaped in a way that they were much more concise, flowing more logically, and so on. So I think this is, and it doesn't take a lot of effort. It's not a lot of effort to talk, it's a lot of effort to write. Then I think it's useful to practice simple, clear communication, even when the subject matter is complex. This is sometimes hard, but I think with practice, this will work. It's preferable to use short sentences. This depends also on the language someone comes from. So I come from German language. We have the tendency in German to write extremely long and convoluted sentences. This is not good for scientific writing. And I think it would be also good if you would volunteer to review papers for journals, initially maybe with a supervisor, because then you see how others approach this paper writing and which papers work, which papers fail, and why papers fail. And because when you're just a reader of the papers, then of published papers, then of course you only see the good ones that actually passed peer review. But when you review papers, then you see also papers which will fail, and then you can learn probably from the mistakes these authors made. So before you submit, these are now a few points about kind of before you submit your paper to journal. It is eventually everyone approaches the stage who writes a paper and says, I just want to get rid of it. I'm tired of it. I've worked so long on it. Just send it out. I think this is not a good strategy. So because submission, revision, rejection cycles consume a lot of energy and time and should definitely be avoided. First of all, you lose a lot of time because anytime you submit to a new journal before you get the revisions back or before you get the decision back, it can be months. And of course, it's good to accelerate the publication. So how can you avoid that? Submission, revision, rejection cycles. It can be done by selecting a journal that is a good fit for the paper. As I showed very initially, there is some highly desirable papers from the impact factor point of view, from the nature, science, cell, family, but also, of course, many others that are highly preferable or if one can publish in them. But they may not be a good fit. That doesn't mean your story and your science is not good. It just means maybe that the editors would say it doesn't fit to our editorial scope. So even if one has to go to a journal that has a somewhat lower impact factor, I think it's highly preferable than just to try very high and then get rejected and lose time. I think it's very good, especially for young scientists, to get feedback and advice on paper from experienced colleagues and collaborators before you submit, because then these experienced colleagues might be roughly of the type of person who reviews the journal, the paper, and so they might be able to point out limitations. And I think my experience is that experienced people in the lab, in a department, colleagues in the department, they would be more than happy, especially for young scientists, to say, okay, I'm going to read the paper overnight and give you some feedback. And that would maybe save you months of going through revisions and review. And then I think it's good to put yourself in the seat of the reviewer and anticipate or try to anticipate what the reviewers might object to. I mean, you as authors, you know the most about the story. You also know about the weaknesses, you know about the strengths. And I think if you try to put yourself in the position of a reviewer, you might say, if I was the reviewer, where would I object? What's for instance, a gap, and then, or something that's not clear, then you might be able to address it before you send the paper out. And then most importantly, make sure, this is actually legally important also, to make sure that every author or co-author name agrees with the paper, and then specifically with the order of all authors. So you certainly want to avoid that eventually a paper is published and you forgot someone, and then you get angry letters, email, and say, well, I was contributing to that paper. And then you have to file for change of authorship, basically correction, which should be, of course, avoided. Okay, so now one of the unfortunate outcomes of submitting a paper that you have carefully written, that you have maybe discussed with colleagues, it still might be rejected. So in science, rejections are frequent at all stages, papers, grants, fellowship. Everybody hates rejections. So how can you deal with that? It's unavoidable that rejections happen in a career of science. So I found this quote once, which I thought was actually very good and kind of reassuring. So this person wrote, every time I thought I was being rejected from something good, I was actually being redirected to something better. So I think what this would indicate is that one should take a positive attitude to rejections. Don't try to take it personal. The reviewers who reject your paper don't say you're a bad scientist. They don't say you made mistakes. They just say the work you submitted has generated some has flaws which have to be rectified. And I think a very good attitude is to say, I did the best I could and try to improve and try again. So then you might get feedback from reviewers. And here's a few comments about this stage. So these days, it is virtually no paper is accepted outright. It's extremely rare. And getting it through review is a major undertaking. So it used to be, when I started my career, it was not uncommon that you sent in a paper, reviewers came back and said, accept as is. In the last years, I think I've not seen that anymore. Basically, it is a long-winded process to get a paper through review. So you can expect up to 1 year from submission to acceptance. If you're a PhD student, of course, this may mean that your paper will come out, your major paper from your thesis work may come out only after you have actually graduated and maybe moved on. If you're a postdoc, this is more problematic if you want to get into a faculty position, because clearly you will have to, it certainly is very helpful for a faculty position if papers have come out. So I think you should factor in the time factor. The response to reviewers can be sometimes longer than the actual paper. This is an unfortunate development that has happened over the last maybe decade, that it basically has gone out of hand in many journals, that the revisions can take forever to do. Actually, many editors now are addressing that by, for instance, say that journals only allow 1 revision cycle, or that you can come back to this point, you can actually discuss this with editors so that the revisions that you can make are reasonable and you don't have to basically start over again. And then I think one good policy is don't suck up to the reviewers by saying, well, this is the most intelligent comment they ever heard, or so. Just address the criticism factually, because the reviewers just do their work. They try to criticize to make sure that the consistency and the quality of the work is actually correct. And so you don't have to flatter them. They do their work, and you do your work by factually addressing these comments. So now I have a couple of comments about managing the process of revision. So I think a good attitude is to assume that reviewers are generally sensible people and want to improve the paper. They're not your enemy. They don't know how to get you. They're not out to put you down. Their goal would be, and usually is, I mean, there's of course exceptions, but the goal usually is that the reviewers want to make sure, and it's actually their task to make sure that the quality of the paper is correct. There's no mistakes, inconsistencies, contradictions, and so on, or misinterpretations. And so they are not your enemy, and neither is the editor. Take the reviewer's comment seriously. Do not try to argue every point by only changing some wording. I think it's good to argue when you think you're right, but just trying to say, I don't want to do any extra experiments and I'm just going to argue the point usually doesn't work. So I think it's good to show to the reviewer that you take their comment seriously and you're responsive. Then I think it's a good policy especially in complex cases, to talk to the editor. Because if you don't know what the editor and the reviewers expect, you cannot talk to the reviewers, of course, but you can talk to editors. And many editors are willing to discuss with you the expectations what should be changed in the paper to address so that it might pass the reviewers' objections. So to adjust expectations for additional data. Journals are sensitive to the cost of associated with revisions. Sometimes or frequently reviewers ask for things to be done, which are simply not reasonable because they cost a lot, they might take a lot of time, they're maybe even impossible to do, and that you can point out and discuss with an editor, and editors are usually very responsive to that because they also know that every month someone works on a paper costs money. Every time someone does an experiment that does not substantially add to the paper, this is wasted resources for science. To discuss grievances with reviewers, if you think that the competitor wants to slow down your paper, this sometimes happens. Sometimes it's pretty apparent, and this can certainly be discussed. I think it's even possible with editors to discuss a plan for the revision. So you basically would make a plan and say, I plan to address the objections from the reviewers in the following way by making the following points, the following experiments. And would you agree that if I do that, then the paper would be acceptable? And many editors are engaging in such discussions, sometimes very constructive discussions. So they basically can help you to match expectations. And the last point here is also clear. So this was now some comments about the project plan, how to actually write a paper. And now every project has also problems and possible solutions. So I'll now go fairly quickly through a list of problems that frequently occur. I mean, these are problems in the sense that that's where many paper writers fail to write a paper. And so I put them here as in a couple of categories: data, results, but no story, underestimation of time required, underestimation of effort required, effort spent in the wrong place, and the never-ending story. So for each one, I have just a couple of comments. So this would be the first point: data and results, but no story. So this comes back to the point I made before. I think it's advisable not to start writing till you can tell a coherent story to colleagues, friends, or someone else. This is simply, we will learn from that whether the story has gaps, whether it flows, and if that's not the case, then it's time on the computer is wasted. I think good experience to get a story straight is to go away, for instance, go for a walk, or sit somewhere quiet, or go for a bike ride or whatever, to construct the story in your mind. Don't sit around at the keyboard with nothing to write. I think this is stressful for most people, and then it leads to actionism, where one starts writing, but the text is going to be useless. Ideally, the story in your head should be ready when you plan the experiments. That, of course, is the ideal case, so that the story develops yourself. So don't just go and do random experiments and try at the end to fit it together into some kind of story. That usually is very hard. But if you at the beginning already knew, maybe discussed with your supervisor or a colleague and said, I think this is how I would like to develop the story, and for that I will do these experiments, then it's at the end much easier to write. Okay, then this is the second point: underestimating of time required. I found that as a rule of thumb, to write a page of text is about 1 day of writing. This includes revisions and so on. So the idea that one would just quickly sit down and write a paper over the weekend is simply not going to happen unless someone is extremely talented. But for most people, paper writing is a serious effort and takes serious amount of time. Many also say, maybe towards the end of a PhD thesis, well, I actually have time, I have a lot of data, and I'm going to write 3 papers. So I think this is great, but I think the good advice would be to write one paper at a time and forget about the other two, but do that one and then do the next one. Just trying to do 3 times the work in parallel on 3 papers generally doesn't work. Maybe there's exceptions, but I haven't seen many. 1 paper at a time, I think, is good policy. And then I've seen, I had postdocs in the lab who said, oh, I want to publish something, I will have a draft for you on Monday. This does not really work. Not even by Tuesday. I mean, to have a draft that is actually sensible is a serious effort. Maybe this one page a day is a reasonable rule of thumb. So the next point here, for most, writing is the hardest part of scientists' work. It's relatively, we were trained as experimental scientists. We are trained to go to the lab, do an experiment, we get very good at it, it's very social, we can chat with people, go for coffee, and this all doesn't work when we have to write, because you cannot write for 5 minutes and then have a coffee, have a chat, and then write again for 5 minutes. So I think good solutions would be get into routine, maybe by organizing a couple of hours a day or more, and then really stick to it and write during that time, get rid of distractions, create extended periods of uninterrupted time, and find a place and situation that fits you. Usually around the lab or the coffee machine is suboptimal for writing, because you constantly are distracted out of the thought of putting the text together, and then it's many people find it hard to get back in. So I can't read the headline here, but so the fails where papers basically fall apart oftentimes is the coherence of the story of the message. I think this is high, this is extremely important, where you should spend most of the time. The structure of headings, so this what I meant with this substructure of the actual results section. What is the section about? What was done? And then nice sentences and big words would come last. So I think if one were to make some graph where the effort should go, I think it's conceptual is most of the time. Then putting the words into the right structure is probably second important, and then making the sentences nice and easy to read and grammatically correct, I think is the least of the effort. And maybe someone can even help you with that, especially those who are foreign language. Certainly someone who is English speaking might go through and make the text nice, but someone who is English speaking but not involved in the project will never be able to help you with the conceptualization of the story. Endless edits are inefficient and really, really annoying. So this is the never-ending story where someone says, I'm now have a paper, and then start writing, and then the person will do another experiment and try to fit it in. And I think this is really extremely inefficient and time-consuming. So I think it's really, again, to the point one should only start writing if one has the story and the whole data together. So then this is, I discussed this already, and I think every science project is evolving. Of course, while for instance, a student or a postdoc is working on a project, then and one thinks one has now the data together to publish, then still the story might develop. Maybe a new idea comes up and the auxiliary data are being generated. And I think this is then dangerous to get into an endless cycle. And I think it's good policy to freeze a story at one point and then say, this is now what I have. And here now I freeze it, and that's what I'm writing. And then not just add any new data in because it changes the flow. Now, of course, you might find that by preparing the flow of the story, that there's some important gap, and then this gap, of course, should be filled with new data. But what I'm arguing here is that one should not just say, well, whatever data come along, we try to fit into the paper, because then the paper is never finished. Perfection is very hard to achieve, and then let the reviewers define the path to perfection. I think one should do as well as one can, and then send it in, maybe after circulation through some colleagues. So now that this was basically potential problems and possible solution, problems which frequently occur, and I've seen many papers derailed by any of these points I just discussed. And now I'd like to basically conclude, assuming you have now done all these things very well, your paper will be published. And this is something, of course, is an achievement, and you should celebrate. But you're not done with it. Especially these days, it is not sufficient to just have a paper out. This used to be the case. I mean, there were things like current contents, when then others went through every week and read about papers published. These days, this is not the way it works, as you probably know much better than I, because I'm old and not in this so much in the social media world. But it's clearly important, if your goal is to take your valuable work, and to increase the impact, you should share on social media, submit the work to conferences, for papers, for posters, or for a talk. Make key people in the field aware of the work. They might cite you in a review, cite the paper in a review, which is great, because then a larger number of people appreciates what you have done. You might even write a review yourself if you have a sufficient amount of information, maybe 2 or 3 papers published in a field, and then you might write a review and highlight your own work, of course, not exclusively, but in the context of others. I think you should talk about the paper often within your department, so that people, or with friends, colleagues, that people know that the paper came out, and present posters on the paper content, and maybe hand out or send around PDFs, which is actually allowed by many journal editors. So I think then the same paper, kind of promoted or not promoted, might accrue more visibility, and over time also more citations, and therefore increase the impact of your work, and therefore advance your career. So with that, I thank you for your attention, and happy publishing. I wish everyone great success in the field of science and career in science. And I hope some of these comments were useful for you to avoid some of the common pitfalls. So now I think we go to discussion section.
Yes. Thank you so much, Ruedi, for a lot of insights and experience and very useful tips during the whole process of writing and publishing cycle. So I guess I am sure that everyone learned a lot. So it seems that we need to have a smart cat at home. I remember you had a dog, right? So there are a lot for us to, yeah. There are lots for us.
Also good listeners.
Yeah, there are a lot of for us to digest and think, I think. So I actually didn't confirm with you. Are you okay that you will share the PPT with us in the future, so that we could post it online to HUPO members?
To share what? This presentation?
Yeah, the presentation.
Yeah,
and
that's
also
fine,
the
yeah.
recording. Yeah, that would be very helpful, so that we can replay and think more in the future. So I think we already had a lot of questions from this pool everywhere, and I guess we could address some highly voted questions. Okay, now I see the new winner is the top one, which has 20 votes, is what are the factors that may lead to the rejections? I think you already discussed about how to handle rejections. So can you comment a little bit about the common factors that may lead to rejection? Maybe the impact factor is too high.
So there's, of course, rejections at various levels. most journals these days, at least the ones which are good, are journals on the high, let's say high class, I mean high impact factor journals, they try to have vetting by editors or an editorial board. And so there the rejections are usually due to a lack of fit. Every journal has some kind of territory which they like to publish and be known for. And if a paper that is submitted is outside of this territory, they might reject it, even if the science is very good. And then, of course, there is the other thing is glaring mistakes or omissions, or just basically the paper is not readable because it's not clear language. And that is already pointed out by the editors. The editors are not supposed to do a quality assessment. They're not to say the paper is a good paper or a bad paper. That's what the reviewers are supposed to do. They're supposed to assess the scientific quality, but sometimes, of course, the paper is so convoluted and poorly written or outside of the field that editors will turn it around. So that's the first place where papers are rejected, and the grounds they usually, as I just discussed. And then if the editor decides to send the paper out to referees, then the referees, they will read the paper carefully and they write a report. And the critiques that come out are usually, I mean, it could be experimental error. For instance, that someone simply made a mistake in an experiment, mistakes in the experimental design, lack of statistical power. If someone claims something and from say population studies, and the population was only 10 individuals, then they claim something and which simply is not supported statistically, so it's more an anecdotal observation. These are very common reasons for rejection. Basically, a paper is rejected by reviewers if the reviewers did do the job, if it is scientifically not sound, and if let's say the pieces that are not sound are minor, then it can be revised, and then sometimes someone decides, a reviewer decides that this is basically cannot be rectified, and then the paper is rejected. Interestingly enough, I mean, I followed this many times, when comparing a paper as it is originally submitted and how it looks after revision. So sometimes the revision, rebuttal letter, and all the argument is longer than the paper. I already said that. And then when you look how is the paper now different from what was originally submitted, it usually is a few sentences. So I think if a paper is going to revisions, it is almost there, but one still has to convince the reviewer. And if the mistakes are grave enough, that then the reviewers will reject it. And this can be all of the points I mentioned before.
Great, yeah, to have solid work first and then present it properly, I guess. That's
yes.
Yeah. So another question is about the Chat GPT, the AI. So I think this is now very popular since this year. So do you think that AI assistant tools would revolutionize the research writing? Because I know that some journals are actually now forbidden to have ChatGPT as an author, right? So what is your take on this note?
Yeah, that's of course a very new and very complicated issue. I mean, if the robot is simply writing the text that you would write, but maybe in a clearer way, then I think this would be actually fine. This is like if you wrote something, let's say you're not an English speaker, you write a very clear, a very concise, very well-structured paper, but it is linguistically substandard. Then it benefits from someone, maybe an English speaker, who would put it into proper language. And I think this is desirable for the reader as well as for the author. And I see nothing wrong with that. If a robot was doing that part, then I think there would be nothing wrong with using a robot. But if the robot basically imposes its background knowledge onto the paper, writing on the contents of the paper, then it becomes problematic, because the robot, of course, is trained in a certain amount of background data and then writes the text based on the training data set. Now, one could argue that the scientist is also trained on some background knowledge. I mean, we also read papers, we talk to people, we also form our own background. But I think the difference is that the scientist should put his mind and his intelligence to writing, formulating the text, and not a robot, because I think this is what makes a scientist that you can point out advances in the field that I think are better argued than currently a robot can. I mean, yeah, it's actually very dicey to make these arguments because it's so new, and no one knows how this will develop. Maybe in a few years, all you have to do is make some figures, make some keywords, and send it to Chat GPT, and it writes a perfect paper. I don't know. It's new land. It's worth discussing this, but I would still think that the scientist who has done the experiment, conceived the experiment, will have a better basis to actually communicate what came out than a robot who simply summarizes a lot of background knowledge.
Yeah, thanks for this. I think the writing part might be nice to be assistant from these AIs, but I also tried some very serious scientific question, and sometimes it just make the things up. So I guess we will see in the future whether they can be more accurate with information. So I will let the other panelists, Blending and Depi, do you want to ask some questions or pick up your favorite from the list? Depi?
Okay. So yeah, so the next question, like we have received quite a lot of questions, and I think that shows that how people were involved, how everyone was involved, and I really like your talk. It was very enlightening. So I'm just going to pick, because we have prepared some questions in case we don't have much, but I can see like we even couldn't go to our question set, so we have a lot here. So I'm just going to pick one more. So which is like, what are the common mistakes for non-native writers? If you have any advice on that.
Well, I think depends what language people come from. So I mentioned I'm coming from German language, and there the mistake is clearly to make too convoluted, complicated sentences. I don't know enough other languages to generalize, but I think it is fair. It's fair enough if a foreign language speaker will not write the same quality of text from a linguistic point like a native speaker. But that doesn't mean that the work that's being written down is worse, of course. So I think if the structure and the contents, the meaning is clearly shown, even in flawed language, that can be relatively easily rectified. So I would think that, so I cannot really answer what is the most common mistake. I think a foreign language speaker makes, I would assume the mistake is that the language is not maybe grammatically correct or linguistically correct, but I think all the other steps going through formulating the message, structuring the message, making the points in the right order, can be done in imperfect English, which can then be fixed. What cannot be fixed easily is if the underlying structure and the meaning of the paper is not clear or is flawed, then this cannot be easily fixed, and that's actually independent of the language which languages someone grew up. So I think everyone is able, from every language background, is able to write the paper linguistically not perfect, but otherwise very well. And then this can be fixed at the end relatively easily.
Yeah, I totally agree what you said. And not to take too much time, the second question is, it's, I don't know how you're going to answer, but this is like, universities with big names get accepted more easily.
Yes. So this is actually probably true.
Mm-hmm.
And this is also true in, for instance, grant writing. So the reviewers try, of course, to be unbiased, but I think they're not. And that's, I think, simply a fact. One should also, I mean, I mentioned at the beginning, in this kind of background section, that this is actually a huge industry. So it's $28 billion in, I think was the number in 2019. So journals are also business. And of course, journal will make more money if it's more profitable, if it has visibility. And so there is a clear interest of the journal's side to also attract to their journal. It's actually very competitive and very good articles, innovative, exciting articles are welcome for journals because they know they will eventually be cited a lot, and they bring up also the commercial value of a journal. So it is true that I was once involved with the forming of a new journal early on, a molecular systems biology, which is from EMBO Press. And they did very, very extensive analysis after a certain number of years about what factors determine the citation rate of the papers eventually. And clearly, one factor was the name recognition of the authors. And so that is, of course, then leads to, maybe not voluntarily, but it leads to bias. So I think the point is that the person raised the statement or the question is, yes, I think there is a bias. I think it's not by bad will, but it's inherent in the system because it is also a profit-driven system.
Yeah, just to add on to this, like not to discourage people, that good works always speak, and so if anyone else wants to speak, take questions.
Yeah, I will just ask a question. Thank you, Professor, for this presentation. I really enjoyed it. As a postdoc, I'm in the middle of writing papers, so definitely will be helpful to take advice from you. I have a question about the position of your name in the authorship list, right? We know the first and the last name are counting more than those in the middle, but is there any impact on the position of your name on the author list for your career or the factor you have for writing, for example?
Yeah. So I think this is now, I mentioned this analysis from Mike Lauer, where he looked about the number of authors per paper, an average over time, and this is going up. And also clearly more impactful paper tend to have even maybe larger numbers of authors. So this is an issue which is acute, where people are acutely aware, and people are in the recruitment committees should be acutely aware of and deal with it. So the fact is clearly that first author or joint first author, and many journals allow now 2 or 3 joint first authors, and these joint first authors are equivalent. So if you're a joint first author among 3 and your name is listed 3rd, you're still a first author. Mm-hmm. So this is of course important to know. Then I think what many journals are trying to do now is to say some person may have contributed to try to identify what people contributed. It could be, for instance, in a larger study that someone is a statistician, has contributed to that to statistical analysis of the data, And that person would probably not be neither first nor last, would be somewhere in the middle. But it should be then identifiable that the statistician really made a critical contribution to the paper by performing statistical analysis. That's just an example. It could also be someone who provides data or does something else that is a critical component. And I think if someone has several papers where they contribute their expertise, then the field of expertise will start to crystallize out or could be pointed out. I mean, the person could write then in their CV, I have been a part of a number of larger studies, and my contribution consistently was to perform statistical analysis on large data sets, for instance. I think from career advancement point of view, it's good to try to engineer a balanced CV. So if balanced, I mean, no one will have just first author papers, very likely, it's very unlikely, especially if you work in a large research group. And so I think if there's a mix of first author papers, and these first author papers, even if it's not many, they would identify a consistent thread of your interests and your accomplishments, then I think this is great. And then this could be bolstered or added on with a number of papers where you might be middle author. And then I think this is a great balance. If someone has a number of papers and just even a very large number of papers, but if these papers are on all kind of different topics and the person is always somewhere in the middle, then I think it is hard to advance the career, because the reviewers or people who might want to employ you might find it hard to figure out what is it about that scientist? What is he or she for? What's her interest or his interest? So I think to build a consistent thread of a line of interest is actually probably what counts more. And if this is partly on first author papers and partly on middle author papers, I think this is perfectly fine.
Okay, well, thank you very much for your presentation and your time today. I think we all really enjoyed to listen to you today, and I will give the mic to Yangqing now to conclude. Thank you again.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Thank you very much, Ruedi. So there are a lot of questions that we didn't manage to cover, which is kind of expected. I would take the liberty to encourage people to write to Ruedi if you have individual questions. I remember that when I was doing a PhD, before I go to Ruedi's lab, I already write questions to him, and he always gives an answer. So that's very extraordinary. So thanks, Ruedi, for this great class. Again, please keep an eye on the HUPO ETC and our following webinars. In the very near future, we'll have a 4th webinar in which another great speaker will cover the grant writing related skills. So this webinar is over. Thank you. Have a nice day and goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, Ruedi. Thank you so much.
Bye.